They paid $1 for her life, but what they unleashed would echo across the frontier for generations. This is a story that will shake you to your core about courage, redemption, and the price of seeing what others refuse to acknowledge. If you're ready for tales from the Old West that'll grip your soul, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Let's ride into a story they tried to bury. The year was 1882, and the dusty streets of Silverbrook, Arizona Territory buzzed with the kind of tension that made even seasoned cowboys check their six-shooters twice. The Apache Wars had left scars deeper than canyon cuts, and fear hung in the desert air like heat shimmer on a summer's day. In this unforgiving landscape where survival trumped compassion, an auction was about to take place that would test every man's conscience. Jack Morrison stood apart from the crowd gathering near the weathered wooden platform in the town square. His weathered face, marked by years under the relentless sun, carried the quiet strength of a man who'd seen too much but never stopped believing in what was right. The silver badge on his vest caught the morning light. Deputy Sheriff, a title that meant everything and nothing in a place where justice often came from the barrel of a gun. His calloused hands, steady as mountain stone, rested near his Colt .45, not from habit, but from the growing unease that crawled up his spine like a sidewinder in tall grass. The crowd's attention focused on a makeshift stage where a young Apache woman stood in torn calico dress, her dark eyes blazing with defiance that no amount of degradation could extinguish. She was tall, taller than most men in the crowd, and her presence commanded attention even in chains. The townspeople whispered cruel words about her size, calling her unnatural and too big for decent work, but Jack saw something they all missed. In her eyes burned the fire of someone who'd never truly surrender, and in her bearing lived the dignity of a people who knew the land's secrets better than any white settler ever would. The auctioneer's voice cracked like a bullwhip across the morning air as he began his shameful trade. "What am I bid for this Apache girl? She's strong as an ox, though some might say too big for household work." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd as men shifted uncomfortably, their consciences warring with their wallets. The girl, barely 17 by Jack's estimation, stood with her chin raised, refusing to let them see her break even as iron shackles bit into her wrists. Jack's jaw tightened as he watched respected businessmen and ranchers size her up like livestock. The war between the Apache and the settlers had ended, but its ugly aftermath played out before his eyes in this human marketplace. She'd been captured during the final skirmishes, when families fled into the mountains seeking refuge that never came. Now she stood as a symbol of conquered pride, reduced to a commodity in a world that measured worth in dollars and cents. The bidding started at 50 cents. The insult hung in the air like gun smoke, and Jack saw the girl's shoulders tremble, not with fear, but with rage so pure it could have melted steel. Her dark eyes swept the crowd, memorizing faces, cataloging enemies. When her gaze met Jack's, something passed between them, a recognition that transcended the hatred dividing their peoples. She saw in him what he saw in her, a soul that refused to be broken by circumstances beyond their control. But what happened next would change everything, setting in motion events that would shake Silverbrook to its very foundations. From the back of the crowd stepped a figure that made even the boldest men take a step backward. Samuel Hartwell, the territory's most notorious trader in human cargo, approached the platform with measured steps. His black coat flapped like vulture wings in the desert wind, and his pale eyes held the cold calculation of a man who'd built his fortune on others' misery. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, whispers following in his wake about missing people and unexplained disappearances. Hartwell's reputation preceded him wherever he went. A man who dealt in the kind of business that decent folks didn't speak of in daylight. Some said he ran a network of forced labor camps in the deep desert, others whispered about connections to Mexican slavers who operated beyond the reach of territorial law. What everyone knew for certain was that people who went with Hartwell rarely came back, and those who did return carried shadows in their eyes that spoke of unspeakable horrors. The auctioneer's voice wavered as Hartwell raised a gloved hand. $1, he said, his voice carrying across the square like the whisper of death himself. The crowd fell silent, recognizing that this was no ordinary purchase but something far more sinister. The Apache girl's composure cracked for the first time, and Jack saw genuine fear flicker across her features as she realized her fate might be worse than death. The hammer was about to fall when a voice rang out clear as a church bell on Sunday morning. $5. Jack stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun but, knowing full well he'd just declared war on the most dangerous man in the territory. Every eye in the square turned to Jack Morrison as he walked toward the platform, his spurs jingling like death knells with each step. $5 represented 2 weeks' wages for most men, but more than that, it represented a direct challenge to Samuel Hartwell's authority. The crowd held its breath as these two forces, law and lawlessness, prepared to collide in the dusty arena of human commerce. Hartwell's pale eyes fixed on Jack with the intensity of a rattlesnake sizing up its prey. "That's a considerable sum for a deputy sheriff, Morrison. Perhaps you've been supplementing your income in ways the territorial government wouldn't approve of." His words carried the subtle threat of a man who knew how to destroy reputations with whispered rumors and carefully placed lies. The crowd murmured, suddenly seeing Jack not as their protector but as a potential corrupt official. Jack felt the weight of every stare, every whispered judgment, but his resolve never wavered. "My money's as good as anyone else's, Hartwell. Unless you're planning to bid higher." The challenge hung in the air between them like the scent of approaching thunder. Behind him, Jack could sense the town's power structure shifting, alliances being reconsidered, and his own future hanging by the thinnest of threads. The Apache girl watched this confrontation with new interest, her intelligent eyes darting between the two men who now held her fate in their hands. She'd learned enough English during her captivity to understand the stakes, and for the first time since her capture, she saw a glimmer of something she'd almost forgotten: hope. But what Jack didn't know was that Hartwell had recognized something in the girl that made her worth far more than any price they could name. As the tension between Jack and Hartwell reached its breaking point, memories flooded the Apache girl's mind like water through a broken dam. Her name was Ayanna, which meant eternal blossom in her people's tongue, though she hadn't heard it spoken with love for months. She wasn't just any Apache, she was the daughter of Chief Naalnish, the legendary war leader who'd held the U.S. Army at bay for 3 years before his final defeat. Her unusual height came from a mixed heritage, her grandmother having been a towering Comanche warrior woman whose bloodline carried the strength of the High Plains. But Ayanna possessed something far more valuable than noble blood or physical strength. During the final desperate months of the Apache resistance, she'd served as her father's messenger and scout, learning the location of every hidden water source, every secret trail, every cache of weapons and supplies scattered across 1,000 square miles of desert wasteland. In her mind lay a treasure map more valuable than any gold mine, the complete network of Apache strongholds and the locations of legendary hordes that could fund a private army. Samuel Hartwell had spent months tracking down survivors of Chief Naalnish's band, slowly piecing together the truth about the chief's daughter. While other buyers saw only a tall, defiant girl suitable for manual labor, Hartwell saw a key to riches beyond imagination. He'd already eliminated 3 other people who'd learned of Ayanna's true identity, and he had no intention of letting a small-town deputy sheriff interfere with his plans. Ayanna realized that Hartwell's interest in her went beyond the usual cruelties of the flesh trade. In his cold stare, she recognized the look of a predator who'd identified his ultimate prize. Her father's final words echoed in her memory: "Guard the secrets of our people, for in them lies the hope of future generations." The auction was no longer about her freedom, it was about the survival of everything her people held sacred. Jack Morrison's $5 bid hung in the air like the toll of a funeral bell, and he could feel his entire world shifting beneath his feet like sand in an hourglass. In the crowd's stunned silence, he heard the whispers beginning, questions about where a deputy sheriff making $30 a month had acquired such a sum, speculations about corruption and graft that would follow him for the rest of his days. His wife Sarah's face flashed through his mind, along with their 2 young children who depended on his reputation for their security and future. The auctioneer looked between Jack and Hartwell like a man caught between 2 thunderstorms, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. "Do I hear $6? He asked weakly, his voice barely carrying over the crowd's murmuring. Everyone knew that Hartwell could outbid any man in the territory, but more importantly, they all understood that crossing him carried consequences that extended far beyond money. Hartwell's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile on a less predatory face. "Deputy Morrison, I admire your charitable impulses. But perhaps we should discuss this matter privately before you commit to something you might regret." The words carried multiple meanings, each one more threatening than the last. The crowd began to disperse slightly, sensing violence in the air like animals before a storm. Jack felt the weight of his gun at his hip and the even heavier weight of his conscience pressing against his chest. He'd seen what happened to people who disappeared into Hartwell's network, had found too many unmarked graves in the desert to maintain any illusions about the man's business practices. Standing before him was everything wrong with the frontier: the reduction of human beings to property, the corruption of justice by money and fear, the silence of good people in the face of evil. But as he looked into Ayanna's eyes, he saw something that made his decision for him. A spark of such fierce intelligence and unbroken spirit that he knew she represented something worth any price he might have to pay. $6. Hartwell's voice cut through the morning air with the finality of a judge's sentence, and Jack felt his heart sink as the reality of his situation became clear. The slave trader's resources were virtually unlimited, and this had become less about money than about power and control. Around them, the crowd sensed the shift in momentum, and several men who'd been watching with interest began to drift away, unwilling to witness what might happen next. Jack's mind raced through his options, each one more desperate than the last. He could try to outbid Hartwell, but that would only delay the inevitable while bankrupting his family. He could attempt to arrest the man, but on what charges? Slavery was legal in many territories, and Hartwell's operations technically fell within the bounds of territorial law. The badge on his chest suddenly felt like a millstone, a symbol of authority that meant nothing when confronted with the harsh realities of frontier justice. The Apache girl, Anna, though Jack didn't yet know her name, watched the proceedings with the calculating gaze of a chess master trapped in an impossible position. She'd seen the deputy's genuine desire to help her, but she also recognized the futility of his gesture. More than that, she'd begun to understand the true nature of Hartwell's interest in her. The way his pale eyes lingered on her face, the subtle questions he'd asked during his examination, he knew who she was and what she represented. As the auctioneer raised his hammer to finalize Hartwell's winning bid, time seemed to stretch like taffy in the desert heat. Jack Morrison stood at the crossroads of his life, knowing that whatever happened in the next few seconds would define not just his future, but the kind of man he would prove himself to be. The hammer began its descent when a voice rang out from the crowd, not offering money, but something far more dangerous: the truth. "That's Chief Naalnish's daughter." The shout came from an unexpected source: old Pete Kowalski, the town's half-drunk telegraph operator who'd spent more years on the frontier than most men had been alive. His weathered finger pointed directly at Ayanna, and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd witnessed history firsthand. "I was at the peace talks 3 years back. That's the chief's girl, the one they called sky-touched, on account of her height." The effect of his words was immediate and electric. The crowd, which had been slowly dispersing, suddenly pressed forward with renewed interest, their expressions shifting from bored indifference to sharp calculation. Everyone on the frontier knew the legends surrounding Chief Naalnish's final defeat, the stories of hidden gold, weapons caches, and sacred sites that the Apache had concealed before their surrender. If this girl truly was the chief's daughter, she represented more than just another piece of human property. Hartwell's carefully maintained composure cracked for the first time, his pale eyes flashing with an emotion that might have been fear or fury. He'd spent months orchestrating this moment, bribing officials and eliminating witnesses to keep Ayanna's true identity secret until he could claim her legally. Now his carefully laid plans were unraveling in front of half the territory, and he could see other men in the crowd beginning to reassess the girl's value. Jack felt the pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place in his mind. Hartwell's unusual interest, the girl's obvious intelligence and bearing, the way she carried herself with the dignity of someone accustomed to respect and authority. She wasn't just a casualty of the Apache Wars, she was a living repository of secrets that men would kill to possess. But Pete Kowalski's revelation had done more than expose Ayana's identity. It had transformed a simple auction into something far more dangerous, and Jack could see the greed awakening in men's eyes like wildfires spreading through dry grass. The crowd erupted into chaos as the implications of Pete's revelation sank in. Men who'd shown no interest in the auction suddenly began shouting bids, their voices creating a cacophony of greed and desperation. $10. $15. $25. The numbers flew like bullets, each one representing dreams of Apache gold and hidden treasure maps. The auctioneer, overwhelmed by the sudden frenzy, struggled to maintain order as more men pushed forward, waving money and making increasingly wild offers. But amid the chaos, Jack noticed something that chilled his blood more than a winter wind through canyon walls. Hartwell hadn't joined the bidding war. Instead, he'd stepped back from the crowd and was making subtle hand signals to men positioned at strategic points around the square. The slave traders' network of associates began moving with practiced efficiency, surrounding the auction block while appearing to be casual observers. Ayana watched the unfolding madness with the detached fascination of someone witnessing her own execution. She understood that Pete's well-intentioned revelation had signed her death warrant as surely as if he'd put a gun to her head. Once these men learned that she truly possessed knowledge of Apache treasure sites, they would never allow her to fall into someone else's hands. The bidding would continue until violence erupted, and in the ensuing bloodbath, she would disappear, probably forever. On the ridge overlooking the town, Takoda and his warriors tensed as they watched the situation spiral out of control. Their original plan had been to wait for nightfall and rescue Ayana under cover of darkness, but the crowd's growing frenzy made it clear that she might not survive the day. The eldest warrior made rapid hand signals to his brothers, and they began preparing for a daylight assault that would either free their chief's daughter or ensure they died trying. The storm that had been building since dawn was about to break in ways no one could predict, and Jack Morrison found himself standing at the center of a hurricane that would reshape everything. As the bidding reached fever pitch and Hartwell's men continued their subtle repositioning, Jack Morrison faced the most important decision of his life. He could see the trap closing around not just the Apache girl, but around everyone in the square. When the shooting started, and it would start as surely as the sun rose each morning, innocent people would die alongside the guilty. His wife Sarah and their children were safe at home, but dozens of other families had members in this crowd who were about to be caught in crossfire that would make the Apache wars look like a church picnic. The deputy's hand moved to his gun, not in preparation for violence, but to feel the weight of the responsibility it represented. The badge on his chest had always meant something to him. Not just authority, but the obligation to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Today, that meant not just the Apache girl whose name he still didn't know, but every person in Silverbrook who was about to be caught up in a war they didn't understand. Jack caught Ayana's eye across the chaos of the bidding crowd, and in that moment, he made a choice that would echo through both their lives forever. Moving with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to violence, he drew his .45 Colt and fired a single shot into the air. The thunderous report echoed off the surrounding buildings like the voice of God himself, and the square fell instantly silent except for the ringing of ears and the nervous stamping of horses. "This auction is over," Jack announced, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who'd made his final choice. "I'm placing this girl in protective custody pending investigation into her legal status." It was a complete fabrication. He had no legal grounds for such action, but the badge on his chest and the gun in his hand gave his words weight that transcended the law. What happened next would test every man's courage and determine whether justice could survive in a place where might had always made right. The silence that followed Jack's declaration stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point, and every man in the square understood that they stood at the edge of an abyss from which there would be no return. Hartwell's network of associates moved with predatory precision, their hands drifting toward concealed weapons as they awaited their leader's signal. The crowd, caught between greed and sudden fear, began to back away from what they sensed would become a killing ground. "Deputy Morrison," Hartwell said, his voice carrying the cold finality of winter wind through a graveyard, "you're making a mistake that will cost more lives than you can imagine. That girl belongs to me by right of purchase, and I will not be denied what is mine." His pale eyes swept the crowd, cataloging allies and enemies with the calculating gaze of a general preparing for battle. Stand down now, and I'll allow you to walk away from this. Continue on your current path, and I'll ensure that your family joins you in whatever grave they dig. The threat against his wife and children hit Jack like a physical blow, but instead of weakening his resolve, it crystallized his purpose with diamond-hard clarity. He'd spent too many years watching good people suffer while evil men prospered, had found too many unmarked graves in the desert to maintain any illusions about the cost of cowardice. Today, in this dusty square under the merciless Arizona sun, the bill had come due for every compromise he'd made with his conscience. The only mistake here was thinking you could turn this town into your personal hunting ground, Jack replied, his gun steady despite the trembling in his chest. Behind him, he sensed movement as Ayanna stepped closer, and he could feel her strength lending itself to his own wavering courage. This girl is under the protection of territorial law, and any man who wants to challenge that can take it up with me. The words had barely left his lips when the ridge above town erupted in gunfire as Takoda and his warriors began their desperate descent toward the square, their war cries echoing off the canyon walls like the voices of ancient spirits come to reclaim what was theirs. The battle that followed would be remembered in Silverbrook long after the last participant had been laid to rest in the town's windswept cemetery. Takoda and his warriors fought with the desperate fury of men defending the last remnant of their destroyed world, while Jack Morrison discovered reserves of courage he'd never known he possessed. Caught between Apache steel and frontier justice, Hartwell's network of associates found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered by men fighting for something more valuable than money. When the gun smoke finally cleared and the desert wind carried away the scent of cordite and blood, the slavers lay scattered across the square like broken toys discarded by an angry child. Hartwell himself had fallen with Takoda's knife in his chest, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at the sky that had witnessed so much suffering and would now see the beginning of something different. The cost had been terrible: 3 townspeople dead, 2 warriors wounded, and Jack Morrison carrying a bullet in his shoulder that would ache for the rest of his days. But in the aftermath, something remarkable happened. As Ayanna knelt beside the wounded deputy who'd risked everything for a stranger's freedom, she spoke her first words in English since her capture. "My name is Ayanna. In your tongue, it means eternal blossom. Today, you have given that meaning back to me." The Apache warriors, seeing their chief's daughter safe and recognizing the deputy's sacrifice, extended an offer that would change both their people's futures, a treaty of mutual respect and protection that would make Silverbrook the first town in the territory where Apache and Anglo lived as neighbors rather than enemies. Jack Morrison survived his wounds and went on to become the town's sheriff, but more importantly, he became the guardian of a fragile peace that grew stronger with each passing season. Ayanna chose to remain in Silverbrook as a bridge between 2 worlds, her knowledge of both cultures helping to heal wounds that had festered for generations. The frontier was built on hard choices and harder consequences, but sometimes, just sometimes, courage and compassion could triumph over greed and hatred. What choice would you have made in Jack Morrison's boots? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more tales of the Old West where heroes were made not by the guns they carried, but by the stands they took when it mattered most.